Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope that this session helps you with your next steps in planting a life-giving church.
Fantastic. Yeah, great. It's a real privilege to be able to just be with you guys today, and thanks so much for coming all the way. Just a little bit of background about Marinette and I. So we were in Cape Town and lived there and got married there and were newlyweds and felt God call us up to Western Zambia, to a very unreached area, and started planting churches amongst people that never heard about Jesus before, and absolutely loved and hated it at the same time. But God just really breathed on the work that we were doing and just seen incredible things happen. And then about eight years ago, felt God start to stir in our hearts the burden to come back to South Africa and see how we could play a role in building a church that could hopefully inspire other people to plant churches, and what that would look like. And absolutely convinced that the local church is the hope of the world, and that it is God's plan for individual human transformation. It's God's plan for community transformation. It's God's plan to transform a nation and a continent. And we've seen that. We've been privileged to see that in Zambia, in people that never heard about Jesus, villages that never heard about Jesus. And when they accept Christ, exactly what takes place in that village is astounding. The transformation that takes place it's humbling. And know that if God can do that there, He can do that here. And I believe that God loves South Africa, that He loves Southern Africa, and He wants to do something amazing in our day. And I remember being a younger person once praying on Table Mountain overlooking Cape Town and just praying for revival in Cape Town. And me and a few of my friends were just praying on the mountain. And I was probably about 19 years old. When you're younger, you pray these crazy prayers. God. And felt God very specifically say to me that He wanted to do something in our nation that wouldn't be through a church or through a denomination, because He didn't want them to get the glory. He wanted to do something that was bigger than that. That it wasn't about a person, it wasn't about a name or a brand, but it was really about His kingdom. And I think that those moments when you're younger, they shape you. Anyway, so while we're in Zambia, this burden, this desire to play some sort of a role, I thought, well, how do we prepare ourselves? We've obviously been quite effective in church planting in rural contexts, and how do we prepare ourselves? So I thought, I stuck in the bush. Let me sign up to do a master's program that was a research master's on church planting in the Western world. And so I signed up to do that, and it was a lot of research, a lot of reading, looking at different models, what was working, what wasn't working, and what is the data really saying in terms of what's effective. Not just what's effective within a season, but what actually are some of the key principles that make something last beyond the primary leader or the primary group of leaders that were the ones that started it. Because so often these incredible movements would start, but then they would die and they would crash and burn. And they were effective during their lifetime, but then what happened afterwards? What were some of the things that make sure that things would be beyond a person or beyond the initial drivers? And looking at a whole lot of different things and thinking, well, that works, that doesn't work. What does the data actually say? What does the research actually say? And I came across some key principles. I thought, okay, well, these are things that absolutely you need to have. And through that research, I came across this organization in the US called ARC, the Association of Related Churches. And everything that I'd learned, I looked at them and I'm like, they're doing everything. And some things that I hadn't thought of or hadn't realized, And the more sometimes the people are nice from far, but they're far from nice. Have you had that experience? Like they seem amazing, but the closer you get to them, the worse they are. And then just over 3 years ago, me and some other guys went over to America to the ARC conference there and walked into this room of about 4,000 leaders and pastors. And the experience for me, it felt like it was a supernatural experience. It felt like I'd come home. And these people were better than I expected. They were more generous and open-handed. There was no desire to control or to brand or to put a name on anything, but genuinely want to see that God's kingdom advance. And the more we've got to know them, the more that's what they're like. It's amazing. And so just in conversation with them, talking about that, well, how do we do that going outwards? How do we do that going forward? But just some background information, some interesting data. Up until about 1995, the research shows us that church plants, someone that would go out and plant a church, or a couple would go out and plant a church, some of the data shows that the success rate of those church plants was below 20%. So they were judging it over a 3-year period. So over a 3-year period, was that church that planted still actually moving forward after 3 years? Below 20% were successful. Other data showed that it was below 35%. So those are like the two contrasting, depending on how they were doing the research. So it's safe to say it was below 35%. It's a safe conclusion. That was up until 1995. Then in the early 1990s, there was a guy called Charles Ridley. And he looked at this, and he was one of the students of church planting. And he came up with 13 characteristics that he said he thought church planters needed. So he looked at guys that were succeeding, and he looked at some of the characteristics they had and why were they successful, or why were the couple successful, and he looked at some of the things that was inside of these leaders that made them successful. And what they said is, past performance is a predictor of future success. So they weren't assessing the person's desire to be something. They were actually assessing the person, what they had done, who they were, what was their default in their past, and looking at those criteria and then assessing it looking forward. And then those were great predictors of success. And so when they started to do that, and then potential church planters would go through this assessment process, and then some of the bigger church planting movements and denominations started to adopt these 13 criteria in their assessment of potential church planters, the success rate went from below 35% to 68%. That's a massive jump. And so with that, they're like, wow, okay. And then some other people started to add in some other things, and they said, okay, well, let's use this assessment, and then let's add in training. So 2-day, like some sort of a boot camp or training intensive, 2-day intensive training, so that people had a realistic expectation of what the church planting experience would look like, give them some keys and some tools that would actually help them be successful, and then also provide ongoing coaching. And then what that did is that those people that went through that process, so there was an assessment, there was training, and then there was ongoing coaching, it jumped to 88%. Pretty awesome, man. And then there's some other kind of little critical things. So if you could provide running partners, so people that were also in the church planting phase, and they could learn from each other. So the guys were a little bit ahead, a little bit behind, and they were part of some sort of learning community. Then it went up, and then with ARC kind of tweaked some of those things. And with ARC globally now, we're just over 97% success rate. And what that does is that they're also, with ARC, we're assessing it over a 5-year period, not just a 3-year period. And then we've also said, is the couple that initially started the church, the couple that pioneered it, are they still the ones leading it? And is it still growing after 5 years? 97% success rate, which I think is pretty amazing. And so if we really believe that we want to see God's kingdom advance, if we really believe that that we want to see His church advance in the world while we're alive, then I think there's some amazing data that we can use. And I'm pretty convinced that when we stand before God one day, He's not going to ask us how many Instagram followers we had. He's not going to ask us how big our church was. But I do believe we're going to have to give an account of whether or not His kingdom advanced while we were on earth. Did the percentage of Christians, genuine followers of Christ, increase in our lifetime or decrease? Increase in our city or decrease? Increase in our nation or decrease? And I think we need to be, kind of my burden is, and I'm pretty sure that's probably why most of us are in the room, is let's work collaboratively to make sure His kingdom advances, not just our kingdom. And if we can do that, and Marinette and I and ARC, and one of the beautiful things about ARC is it's not hey, you need to do this. It's a learning, collaborative learning community where people are, hey, this is what's working, take it, use it, improve it, change it, tweak it, and if it's working better, give it back to us because we want to use it then. It's a learning community, and we believe that together we are better. And together we can figure things out. Together, if we put our efforts and our best efforts forward, our churches will grow, but we're going to help other churches grow. And we really genuinely going to see His kingdom advance. So Ark is not a denomination. Ark is not a covering. But it is a relationship. And so there's a couple of definitions I'm going to read. It says, we are an association of relational churches, working together with church planters and leaders to provide support, guidance, and resources to launch and grow life-giving churches. So just in this room here, we're churches at different stages in our lives. Some of them are new, some of them are recent church plants, some have been going for a little bit longer, and there's some incredible wisdom in this room. We've got Craig from Clark, who's a bit of a genius in the sermon. He's had so much experience in helping other churches plant. But and there's guys that are new. And as we collaborate, as we work together, as we have relationships, something amazing happens. And we're pretty convinced that God's kingdom advances relationally. God's kingdom advances relationally. Whenever God wants to do something on earth, I believe He puts 2 or 3 people together, or 4 people or 5 people. And so as we intentionally build those relationships, then we see His kingdom move forward. One of the beautiful things about Ark is that it's not about theology. It's about life-giving. So that's how we define a church. Is it life-giving? Well, what is life-giving? Well, if you've been into a life-sucking environment, it's not that. It's not a life-sucking church. It's a life-giving church. It's really centered about Jesus and about bringing hope and healing to people. And how do we do that? What does that look like in the way that we speak, the way that we communicate, the way that we help people, the way that we build church is about helping people have life and step into all that God's got for them, not just for this life, but obviously for eternity. It's a life-giving church. Here's a little statement that kind of clarifies a bit more detail to it. It says, Ark is a group of individuals and churches that believe that the local church is the hope of the world. Together, we exist to launch, connect, and equip life-giving churches, their leaders around the world. We accomplish this through combining our resources together to start new churches, encouraging healthy church growth, and joining forces with other kingdom-minded networks. We want you to be a part of the family. We want to provide you with access to relationships, tools, and environments you need to be the leader God has called you to be. We also want to provide you with the opportunities to display the significance you have inside of you by creating environments where you can invest and impact those leaders coming behind you. So one of the beauties of our journey in serving and building church is that there's always someone that can learn from us. So sometimes we can have like a poverty mentality. No, I need help. But the truth is that we actually have learned some things. All of us have learned some things. It doesn't matter where we are in the process, that we can pass it on to other people. And other people need to get the stuff that's inside of us. And we want to not just be getting information, but we want to also create opportunities where the lessons that you've learned, you can actually pass on to others. And so we can do that by creating coaching platforms and running platforms where we're running and journeying together with other people that are on a similar journey. And so much of that happens naturally when we are building relationships. Obviously, there's more organized environments, like little meetups and conferences and things like that, and writing material and developing material. But so much of those giving and encouraging and getting the information that's out inside of us into others happens through intentional relationships, and helping provide that. So Ark is not a denomination, but it is a relationship. And so we encourage people that if you're in a denomination, if you're in a network, stay with that. Stay with that. But if you want to learn and be a part of collaborating, then let's do that together. So there's kind of, if we were to assess a young couple, people that want to come and plant a church, there's 8 essentials that we think are really, really helpful. And these 8 things are helpful no matter what context you're in. And I was privileged to be in a meeting just over 3 years ago, and we're learning and asking a whole lot of questions. And some Chinese guys from the house church in China were in the same meeting. They'd come over to ARC, and it was in a global discussion group with different people from around the world. And they were asking us some questions about what does it look like, How does art work? Because the house church movement was very, very successful in rural environments. But now China, so much of China has actually moved into urban environments. And it's not, what they were doing wasn't working. And so what they were also realizing is that the second and third generation Christians weren't interested in the way that they were doing church. And so they were losing ground. So they actually came over and said, hey, can you help us? And so we were in a meeting, and they took these 8 principles, and they said, okay, we're going to run with this. And they've planted 13 churches already in urban settings amongst young Chinese people. And again, we were with them in April. Just they were sharing some of the stories and some of the things that are happening, and it's freaking the government out, because the government was okay if it was a house church, but they're not okay with this, because this is freaking them out. It's way too influential, and the government are freaked out. So there was a time where the government were ignoring the house church thing, but they're not ignoring this anymore. And so they're trying to do all sorts of things to close them down. But it's so incredible. Also in Japan, just a bit of background about Japan. There's been once or twice there's been like little churches that have gone. People have gone over. Missionaries have gone there to try and get churches established in Japan. But they, in the history of Japan, outside of a Catholic revival that happened about 500 years ago, that was squashed. Everybody was killed. In the history of Japan, there's never been a church planting movement. There's never been a Japanese life-giving church that is vibrant, that is actually transforming society ever in the history of Japan. It just hasn't happened. But we're seeing, I think at the moment, I was checking with the guys on Instagram yesterday, I think they had 18 churches now amongst young Japanese students. And it is going viral. And it's these basic principles. Now, they look different in different contexts, but the principles work. And I think one of the dangers is as churches grow, as they move from single, well, it's the same as an organism. As an organism moves from a single cell organism, like an amoeba, it doesn't have a complicated system inside of it. But the larger the organization, the larger the organism gets, the more complicated the system needs to be to sustain the size of the growth. And so that's where organs come in. So you've got like a nervous system, and you've got all these different systems inside of a body with different organs that actually provide and enable an organism to get larger. And church is no different. So you can have a very organic church, but it's going to stay small. But when the systems are put in place, those systems enable the church to get larger, because you need to have a dedicated system for doing this. You need to have a dedicated system for doing that. When Marinette and I were first in George, we were very intuitive leaders. And so just by us being around and being intuitive, we could know what the right thing was. We could identify a leader. We could call stuff out. And because we're intuitive, and we just kind of knew, and we're good at that, and it was fantastic. But as we grew, we realized, hold on, we actually need to build away from ourselves and put systems in place. So that it's no longer about our intuitiveness or our giftedness. Is now there's a system that can sustain it, so we're building away from ourselves. So all the things that need to happen can still happen without our direct involvement. And so sometimes what would happen is, and I've made this mistake, and Marinette and I have made this mistake, is that we would go to a conference and we're like, flip, I need a lung, or I need a heart. That's exactly what our church needs. And so we go and we get a heart, and we come and we shove it in the body. But we just thought we needed it, so we just placed it in the body. And sometimes that people will do that with something like Growth Track. They'll take it and they're like, but your heart, if you're going to do organ transplanting, you need to be a bit careful with those things, You can't just shove it in, otherwise you might shove it in the foot and they wonder it's not working, but that's because hearts don't belong in feet. Or there might be a genetic problem, like maybe the DNA doesn't match. And so you need to make sure you're getting the right DNA. And even when you're putting the organ in, you need to make sure it's connected properly. Like this artery is connected, otherwise the blood's going to go and it's going to go wrong way around and all sorts of other stuff. And so even some of those ideas, and that's where the first thing comes in, ACPREs, and the first one is prayer. And we might just say that and say, oh, you need to pray. No, actually, we need to pray. We absolutely need God's wisdom in building life-giving church. And it cannot just be a cut and paste. Yes, we can get great ideas and concepts, but how do we implement those things into the life of our church? We need prayer, and God needs to speak to us. And I'm convinced that prayer isn't just begging God for His grace. And we know that God is way more committed to His church than we could ever be. We're not begging Him to bless us. The Bible tells us He's given us everything we need, but we do need to go to Him to get wisdom and direction, to know how do we put these things in. So the first one is prayer. The second one is build a team. Launch big and grow fast. So if you're going to start a church, we want to help you to launch big. Another interesting stat is Ed Stetson and Warren Bird. They did an assessment on just over 400 churches. They studied just over 400 churches, and they wanted to know what were the critical factors. Did a large launch have a determining factor on the church's success rate? And what they found, they used the number of 100. And they said, at 100, if the church starts on a Sunday service with less than 100 versus if they started more than 100, would they succeed? What are the percentages? And you automatically increase your chances of success by 88% by just having a bigger launch. So you can start in your bedroom. No, not your bedroom. You can start in your lounge. You can start in your lounge. You could. But the truth is, if you start bigger, if you start with more than 100 people on your first Sunday, your chances of success have automatically increased by 88%. So we're going to talk about how do we help people do that? How do we recruit? How do we build teams? So it's not just you welcoming everybody at the door and you doing the worship and you doing this and you doing that, but actually there's a team and everybody knows their place and you've built a great core team that can help you launch well. Then a giving plan. So the big thing is launching, developing a Greek thing. And the other thing is finances. So many times, one of the big mistakes that people in the young, faster growing churches make is they're so scared to talk about money. They're so scared to talk about money because they think, if I talk about money, people are going to leave. But that's not true. If you talk about money in an unhealthy way, people are going to leave. And so you have to have a giving plan. And so with ARC, we would assess 3 things if in a potential church planter. The first one is assessing people's marriage. Like, what is their marriage like? Are they both committed to this? Are they both committed to actually building church? Are they both committed to this endeavor? And are they healthy as a couple? Are they healthy in their hearts and the way they see God, the way they see money? So just assessing their marriage, assessing their money. How do they spend money? Are they healthy? Do they have a healthy relationship with money? Because if they have a healthy relationship with money, guess what? They're going to be able to talk about money in a healthy way. And if they talk about money in a healthy way, people are going to give. So if they have a healthy relationship with money, you're going to solve so many of these problems. And so giving plan, and talking about that. How do we help people actually talk about finances? Because a rapid church growth requires lots of money. We find in our church that we have this little saying, it said the last thing to get saved is a person's wallet. Because we can track it. We've been through seasons of like 200% growth, 70% growth, 80% growth, and you can track it. And you have this. The church is growing, but there's a lag in terms of their finances. And for us, it's about 6 months to a year between the time they come in and they start tithing. And so we need to make sure that we're dealing with those issues as fast as possible. Let people know that you exist. Marketing. There are people in the community that want a church. They might know they need to want a church, but they've got needs that your church can meet, and they're looking for answers, but they don't know about your church. And so you need to find a way to get the information out. How do you communicate to your community that you're there, that you actually have what they're looking for? And my wife is a bit of a genius with this, and one of the things she often says, she says, you need to under-market and over-deliver. Under-market and over-deliver. So in other words, you can't oversell yourself and paint yourself on Instagram or Facebook as this amazing church, and you've like copied and pasted pictures from, Hillsong, and this is your church, and they come in there. That's not it, And so you need to make sure that people, you're marketing properly. marketing to scratch the itch. You're letting people know that you exist and that there's there and they've got needs and we can help them, that there's authentic community, etc., etc. But when they come in, they still need to have that wow factor. Wow, this is better than what I thought. And talking about all of that, and Marianne's going to talk a little bit about weekend services in a moment. So under market, over deliver. I think there's a danger. We live in a world now where Facebook and Instagram has forced us to, not forced us, but has tempted people to live in a false world. So they start projecting something that's not real. I was reading a scary article recently about how you can buy Instagram followers. And you pay a bit of money and you get a whole lot of false followers, you know. And so you can have like a few thousand people following you. Hey, I'm this big leader and I've got so many thousand people following me. But actually, it's not real. But the problem with that is that you're going to have to keep people at a distance then. And that's not authentic community. That's not life-giving. Because as soon as they get closer, they're going to realize you're not what your Instagram says you are. You actually don't have the amount of influence that you think you have or you want people to think you have. And all those things are absolutely critical. Because we want to build a healthy community that's absolutely life-giving. And one of the things that our world is desperately looking for is authenticity. Right location, helping people choose the right location. What do you do? How do you work in the space? How does it work? What is new people coming into it? And these things are not generic, so you can't copy and paste. What works in America is probably not going to work here, and that's true. But there are some principles that work in any environment. But even within, we can learn from each other. What's working? What have you done? And guys at Urban Life, they'd done something amazing with their seats. And I was like, hey, I want that. And they sent me the seating plan, the design. I'm like, okay, let's have a look at this. Can we do this? Because, the right location, you're building your space, how that works, really makes a big difference. And then great weekend services. Great weekend services. And weekend services for unchurched people. It's like we said in the beginning, we don't want to build our church. We don't want to build churches at the expense of other churches. So we don't want to build churches to reach churched people. We want to build churches to reach unchurched people. And when we understand that, and somebody that's unchurched, that doesn't have a concept of church, when they come in, do they come back? When I was younger, I used to think that everything had to happen on a Sunday. And so somebody would come in, and then if they came in, we're going to get them saved. And if they got demons, we're going to get rid of the demons. And we're going to get them water baptized. And they've got marriage problems, we're going to talk to them about it. And we're going to do everything on that Sunday. And then often they never came back. Because I think we were just like, rah, But for us, what we want to do is, and Marianne's going to talk about this in a lot of detail, is we want people to come back. Because if they come back, guess what? They're going to meet some friends. And if they come back again, guess what? We're going to help them with their marriage. And if they come back, guess what? We're going to explain salvation to them. And if they come back, and they come back, and they come back. And something that's helped a lot of us, and I know that I was preaching to a lot of the converted here, is when Jesus called his disciples, he allowed them to belong before they believed and before they behaved. If you think about the disciples that were with Jesus, many of them didn't believe right at the end. They still didn't behave. Peter chopped off the guy's ear right at the end. Jesus is having a conversation with him. He's about to die, and they're like, show me the Father. Like, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Show me. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. They still didn't believe. And we've got to allow people to come in and be a part of something and belong before they believe and behave in exactly the way that we want. And I'm telling you, if they do that in there long enough, they're going to catch it. Their lives are going to be transformed, and we're going to see amazing things happen. So, next steps, have a clear next step process. Once again, this comes down to systems. One of the big systems that we need to have in the life of our church, next steps. So there's two big needs. And if you ask any, and I'm pretty sure all of us will agree that are leading churches, what are the two things you need? You need more money. Yes? Yeah. And we need more leaders and more volunteers. Those are two things. You need more money, more leaders and volunteers. Especially then, the faster you grow, they need more money, the more leaders and the more volunteers. And we need to have a clear next step so we can bring people in that are unchurched. And imagine it a bit like a conveyor belt. Like you've got people that are coming in from different backgrounds, like a conveyor belt that sorts potatoes on a potato farm. So they comes up, digs up all the potatoes, they put on this conveyor belt, and they go along, and the bigger potatoes, they're like export quality, they're like ready for export, they go into one little thing, and it goes a little bit further, and the rotten potatoes, they go into another thing, and so this goes forward, and you're sorting out all the potatoes. So this, in a smaller church, this really happens organically, because through intuitive leadership, and you seeing, you identifying, you calling things out of people. But the bigger a church gets, you need to have a system that does that. A clear next step system that can sustain it. That's not directly requiring giftedness. Giftedness is important, but it's not directly requiring giftedness to do that sorting. And as that happens, so you can say, geez, this potato is amazing. Oh, well, he's ready for leadership. Well, this one, he's rotten. He needs some help before we can do anything with him. Let's put him over here. And so the next steps of growth track really is that. It's helping people through a clear next steps thing. Instead of us spoon feeding people, what we're doing is we're trying to give them the information so that they can take responsibility for their faith, so that they can go on and build and go into all the things that God's put into them. And then healthy church governance. Once again, churches that are smaller when you're starting, who's making those decisions? A lot of times it's lay people, and that you need church governance, absolutely, and how those decisions are made. But as this thing grows, and you get to like around about 300, then often the decision making needs to change. Who's making the decisions? Who's deciding on the paint on the wall? Who's deciding whether or not we need to get a new carpet? Who's deciding if we buy a coffee machine or not? Who's making those decisions? Needs to change again. And then when you get to about 1,000, who's making those decisions need to change, because there's a progression going from lay decision-making to senior staff decision-making. Because some of the lay people, their head's in business 24/7. Maybe they give a couple of minutes or a couple of hours a day into church. But for the guys that are senior on staff, they're thinking, dreaming, reading, studying, praying. They need to have the ability to react quickly. We're in a season of... Craig and I were just talking about a little bit. We're in a season of discontinuous change. And I was listening to a talk somebody gave a while ago, and they're saying that 100 years ago, the amount of information that was available to us today was increasing every 100 years. Sorry, the amount of information that was available was increasing every 100 years. So the world's information or knowledge was increasing every 100 years. At the moment, it's every 3 months. Get your head around that. Okay, so the amount of information that is available is changing is increasing, it's doubling every 3 months. Which brings us into we're going into a world that we've never been before. Change has been constant, but in the last 50 years, the last 20 years, the last 10 years, change is no longer constant. It's change, they call it discontinuous, it's unpredictable change. And so the world is changing at such a rapid rate. That means that we have to be very, very responsive in the way that we do and lead and build church. And so even those decision-making processes, who's making decisions? Are we responsive? Are we adaptable? Are we able to bring the changes rapidly so that we can continue to be effective?